Please make your and there are sufficient chairs for everyone. If we do not social distance, so if you can move in, if there's space in your row, or flag people down in the back to sit with you. One other note that the audio, we're maintaining it as best we can. There are some lighter spots in the room, but kind of the sides towards the front are the hottest areas for audio. So if you're hard of hearing, I do recommend those two areas to sit in. You can see where the speakers are. There's one there, one all the way in that corner. The closer you are to them, the better you'll be able to hear. Is Dale in the room? No? Okay, everyone, if I could please have your attention. Just a couple of administrative announcements before we bring up our next speaker. So first of all, there are available, nope, check that, that's not right. If you do not, if you got a banquet ticket, if you paid for the banquet, but you have not gotten your ticket, it's a small business card size ticket that was with your meal pass, so if your meal pass or your badge says banquet on there, please do go by our registration desk at some point this morning and collect your meal ticket. That will have your entree selection on there, but be sure to do that, please. Secondly, the vendors will be wrapping up after lunch this afternoon, either right after lunch, the Sisters of St. Paul in particular, with their literature table, and then some may stay till between the breakout sessions, but this will be your final opportunity to please patronize the vendor hall downstairs. So I encourage you to do that and to get some books. Joseph Pearce, Fabiola Garza, and flew out of my Father Michael Rainier will be signing books during the lunch hour today, so you can get their books and have those signed at lunch. And then just finally, we are looking for some volunteers, able-bodied men. If you're going to be around tomorrow morning, This beautiful liturgical setup, which we've been able to have, we do have to get this ready to return, and it's just a little bit of heavy lifting. So if anybody, many hands will make it slightly lighter work, okay? So if you're interested in volunteering, please also just check in at the registration desk and put down your cell phone number. That would be helpful. All right, and I guess I will go ahead and introduce our next speaker. He's a man that really needs very little introduction. If you haven't read Wisdom and Innocence, it is one of the finest introductories to Chesterton, wonderful biography, written by our next speaker as an act of thanksgiving for the gift of Chesterton in his own life. I give thanks to God on a regular basis for the gift of this individual in my life, a dear friend, the wonderful Joseph Pearce.
Good morning. It's always a joy to be here. I don't know how many I've been to now, but first one I came to was 2002, and I think I've only missed 3 or 4 since then, so I'm coming up for my 20th, I should think. And of course, one good thing about that is there are many, many familiar faces out there that I've got to know and have become friends with, and we're all watching each other get old, which is sort of bittersweet, right? So I want to talk today about the friendship between Chesterton and Belloc. I don't know whether this is mine, but I'm taking it anyway. And it's actually fortunate, providential, because today is, of course, we're celebrating this conference, of course, the 150th anniversary of Chesterton's birth. So it's an extended birthday party to the great GKC. But as Providence would have it, today is actually Hilaire Belloc's birthday. He would have been 154 years old today, so happy birthday to Hilaire Belloc. So what I'm going to do is to celebrate both men. And what comes to mind when I celebrate Chesterton and Belloc is that Batman and Robin, obviously, right? It's an obvious association. The dynamic duo, right? So we all know that George Bernard Shaw talked about the two men being not just great friends, but so much seen as being as one against common enemies, crusaders for truth, if you like, or for a certain creed in a world that was hostile to it, that he dubbed Chesterton and Belloc the Chester Belloc as a creature. So I want to look at that, the Chester Belloc, and also this dynamic duo. But the thing about the dynamic duo, and this is perhaps the controversial aspect of my talk, you've got to have controversy because it makes life interesting. If Chesterton and Belloc are the dynamic duo, who's Batman and who's Robin? Because I think it's been the tendency, for Chesterton to take the limelight and Belloc to be sort of in his shadow. And I've certainly been a champion. I mean, I've obviously my first biography was a biography of Chesterton, but I also read a biography of Belloc. And part of what I've been hoping to do is to bring Belloc out of Chesterton's shadow and let him not just shine in his own light, so to speak, but both of them shine through the light of God, but so they can stand side by side as authentically the Chester Belloc rather than Batman and Robin. So I'm going to try to compare the two here by talking about their friendship and the legacy that they've left us. So as regards their friendship, we're going back to the beginning of the last century. They first met in 1900 at an anti-war meeting. At that time, there was a war going on in South Africa, the Boer War. And Belloc and Chesterton were at a meeting opposing that war because they saw the British Empire as basically being a bully, what we would now call a globalist entity that was working for globalist entities. In other words, that the British Empire was fighting to ensure that the diamond mines and the gold mines of South Africa would remain safe, and that the profits to these global corporations would be secured against the agrarian Afrikaner farmers. So it's like the small man against the giant, David against Goliath. So that's how they met. They met basically already united in a belief in small communities, small nations, small businesses against the power of the giant. So they had this in common from the very beginning. And at the beginning, there's no doubt at all that Belloc was the influence upon Chesterton. In some sense, at the beginning of their friendship, Belloc was Chesterton's mentor. And there's reasons for this. In 1900, Belloc's 30, Chesterton's 26. But Belloc's married. He has children. He's a paterfamilias. He'd hiked across the United States during the period of the Wild West, all the way to the Pacific coast to woo his young lady, who turned him down. All the way from England to California to be told that his beloved has a vocation for the religious life. Now, Belloc has spent all of his money getting there. So now he's broke as well as being broken-hearted. And literally, we don't know for certain, the legend used to be he walked right across the United States. That's clearly not true. But it does appear, because he was basically penniless, and he didn't have any means of getting back home, he started to walk back to England from California. And clearly walked a great distance up into the mountains. He made his way by sketching. He's a gifted artist. Both Chesterton and Belloc were both gifted artists. Sketching the farmhouse and then presenting himself at the door of the farmhouse and hoping to get bed and breakfast in return for the sketch of the farmhouse. And that's the way he got on. Eventually he meets an old man up in the mountains, and he's from Europe, I think a German or an Austrian, and they're sort of weeping about in nostalgia. And anyway, this immigrant to the United States has pity on Belloc and lends him enough money to get home, and he gets a train, I think, to Philadelphia, actually. I think he had relatives in Philadelphia. That was his excuse, by the way. He couldn't sort of say, I'm going to California to hope a woman's going to say yes to marrying me, because they probably would have got the approval of anybody. So ostensibly, he came to Philadelphia to meet relatives and stayed for a day or so to be polite, and then hiked west. Thankfully, of course, that woman discovered she did not have a vocation to the religious life and ended up getting married, and ended up having 5 children. So by 1900, Belloc's already a paterfamilias. He's not only adventured across America, he'd served in the French army, and had already had some books published, including one of the first, I think, the Cautionary Tales had already been published at this point. So he's actually a well-known, nationally known writer. And Chesterton at this point was completely unknown. 1900 was when his first essays started to be published in newspapers. So there's no doubt at all that at first, Chesterton was looking up to Belloc as the mentor. And that was, for the most part, I think, a good friend, a good influence upon him. But there are some things about Belloc's friendship with Chesterton which I think led to a weakness in Chesterton's thought. And this was addressed somewhat by William Fahey yesterday. Belloc suffered from a rare disease, certainly a very rare disease in England, called manic francophilia. He was born in France, of course, and when he was a baby, not 1870 when he was born, was the Franco-Prussian War, and family actually had to evacuate their home, and Belloc probably got the last train as a baby with his mother, got the last train out of Paris before the siege of Paris. If they hadn't got out, Belloc would probably not have seen his first year, because most children under the age of 12 months died through the hunger and disease caused by the siege of Paris, which followed. So Belloc was always, he had 2 great patriotisms. One for that overrated nation called France, and the other for that great nation called Sussex. And these were the hubs of his patriotism. The nation of his birth, to which he owed a passionate loyalty, but also just the place in which he was rooted, where he spent most of his life, except for a short period in London. Sussex, that wonderful county just south of London. But because Belloc's romantic francophilia, he had this romantic attachment to the French Revolution. And the analogy I sometimes come up with is, Americans, to be an American you sort of define, if you're going to be in America, you're defined by the fact that, of course, you support the Republic. You can't have been on the wrong side in the American War of Independence, because if you're on the wrong side, then obviously you're not an American, right? You can't be a loyalist in that war. You have to be a patriot, right? Otherwise, you're not a patriot. So in many ways, Belloc thought the same thing about France. In order to be truly French, you had to be a supporter of the Republic. In other words, the France established by the French Revolution. So he had his first book, first or second, was a biography of Danton, one of the French revolutionaries. He had this romantic notion about that French Revolution, which was contagious in the sense that Chesterton also got it. And I think it was Dale yesterday that talked about Chesterton's book on Dickens, and T.S. Eliot thought that Chesterton's book on Dickens was the greatest book on Dickens ever written. So it's a great book. But I recently revisited, I'm in the process of writing an introduction to a new edition of A Tale of Two Cities, and revisited Chesterton's essay on that, and to me it's blighted by this sympathy for the French Revolution, and somehow seeing that Dickens as a sympathizer of the French Revolution, which I do not get from Tale of Two Cities at all, so I don't know where he's getting that reading from. So I think there's this Francophilia that Belloc has for maybe understandable reasons, and Chesterton adopts, and that perhaps is not a good influence. But what Belloc did do is to broaden Chesterton's understanding of European history. He understood European history, albeit from a Francophilic perspective, a Francophilic bias. The other influence was Belloc's political and economic philosophy, which of course was rooted in the teaching of the Catholic Church, what is called distributism, and which we're now rebranding as localism. And again, Chesterton himself says, you were, the master in this, we are the disciples. So Chesterton himself says that he learned this economic political perspective from Belloc. Belloc, of course, learned it also from Cardinal Manning and Pope Leo XIII. But so they came together as this seeking economic and political justice, speaking as one voice, eventually becoming known as distributism. One of my favorite stories, which I'm sure you know, if you've read Chesterton's autobiography, you certainly will, that Chesterton's on a holiday. I think I located the house it probably was. Chesterton was on holiday in Rye in Sussex with his wife, and the next door neighbour was Henry James, the American novelist who was living there at the time. Sorry. And he was living there at the time, and Henry James learned that Chesterton was living next door. I think Henry James was living in the same house that R.H. Benson had lived with his brothers and parents prior to that. It's a museum in Rye. But Henry James wants to meet this famous journalist, G.K. Chesterton. So he contrives to come for tea. And Chesterton has this image of Henry James as the sort of very polite, prim Puritan, sipping his tea from his teacup and saucer, Chesterton being on his best behaviour. And then all of a sudden there's a loud banging at the door. And Chesterton goes to the door and Belloc barges in, bellowing for bacon and beer. And the description that Chesterton gives is as if he's been walking across France with a friend, and he says as if they've made a pact of honour, neither of them would wash until they got back to England. But you have this image of this prim and proper Henry James sitting with his mouth wide open as Belloc, looking like a tramp, comes in bellowing for bacon and beer. And what Chesterton says is the distance across the tea table was wider than the Atlantic. And of course, these two men, I want to maybe spend a bit of time comparing them, their relative merits, because what they were, we don't see this as much these days. They were men of letters, so they didn't restrict themselves to one particular genre. They weren't novelists or poets, so it's all a question of not both and. So certainly, in the art of the essay, and that's I think it's an art that needs to be taken more seriously again. They're two of the finest essayists in the whole of English literary history. I wouldn't want to say who's the better essayist. They're both marvelous. I think perhaps of Belloc's, my favorite Belloc, unlike William Fahey there, who has an aversion to favorites. I'm happy to talk about my favorites. They might change, because it's a subjective thing. Your taste might change. I might have an answer. What I say to people, what's your favorite Shakespeare play? I say, well, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, it's Hamlet. But at weekends, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, it's King Lear. So I oscillate. But certainly one of my favorite Belloc essays is that wonderful essay, if you haven't read it, you need to, called A Remaining Christmas. You should read it every Christmas, preferably out loud to someone you love. And probably my favorite Chesterton essay is The Architect of Spears, this wonderful depiction of Gothic architecture as architecture on the march. All the spires are spears, and the spirit of the Gothic being the church militant, Christendom on the march across Europe. As novelists, I have no real hesitation in saying that Chesterton's a better novelist than Belloc. I probably haven't done Belloc justice. I tried reading his novels for a period years ago, with the exception of his late novel, Belinda, was not particularly impressed and haven't really returned. So perhaps I need to go back and try again. I remember in Pongo and the Ball, there's one laugh out loud moment, but for the most part, Belloc's not a great novelist. In actual fact, what made his novels so popular in many ways, they were called Chester Bellocs, because Belloc met with Chesterton and told Chesterton what he wanted to write about, and Chesterton actually came up with, he drew sketches of scenes. And this inspired Belloc's novels. So many of Hilaire Belloc's novels are actually illustrated by Chesterton. As poets, both of them have wrote some great poetry. And Chesterton's greatest poetry is amongst the greatest of the 20th century. But I think Chesterton's a poet. You can see, if you look at Chesterton as an artist, you see Chesterton's works of art, he's a caricaturist. Everything is done at speed and quickly, with that sort of Dickensian grotesquerie, gargoylesque. And he writes his poetry for the most part in the same way. So the collected poetry of Chesterton is sort of that thick, and about that much of it's really any good. Sorry, Dell's here, I'm probably about to be shot. But the best is very good. Whereas Belloc wrote much less poetry in terms of quantity, but the quality is much better. Belloc quite clearly took more time in the composing of poetry. Chesterton did everything with spontaneity. And that's one of the brilliant things. That's why we love him. It's breathtaking, takes your breath away when you're in his company, because everything's happening. You see his mind working, right? And it's just all coming out. That's great for essay writing. He gets away with it with his novels. But certainly with his poetry, sometimes it suffers. But for me, I read my favorite Chesterton poem yesterday, Strange Music. But if you haven't read Hilaire Belloc's Tarantella, do so. In fact, heaven forbid that I'm talking about technology here. Mea culpa, maxima culpa. But if you actually put Tarantella Belloc in YouTube, there are some actually very good recitations by young people of the poem, which is, I would say, warrants 10 or 15 minutes of your time. Now, a defining moment in both their lives was World War I, and I personally am not comfortable with their jingoism. So I wrote a verse drama called Death Comes for the War Poets, which was off Broadway for a while. But it's about Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, these two World War I poets, and about Siegfried Sassoon's conversion. And it's actually about the conversion of death more than anything else, because death in the first part of the play is, like one of the witches from Macbeth. Death's an enemy. Death's something to be feared. But as Sassoon converts to Catholicism, Death herself, she's a female character, Death herself is transformed into a sort of guardian angel, because she's just going to take him up into heaven. But clearly I'm a great lover of World War I poetry, and those men, Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, experienced what J.R.R. Tolkien called the animal horror of trench warfare. And Belloc, he made a lot of money during World War One, and it's not his fault. Someone's going to offer you a lot of money, take it, right? But because he was a military historian, he knew about European warfare, so he was an expert. So he pontificated in weekly articles during World War One about how the war was going to shape up, but he was living in the past. He was looking at the battle strategies from the 19th century, from the Napoleonic Wars or the Crimean Wars, not modern warfare, literally entrenched with barbed wire, poison gas, new weapons of mass destruction. And both Belloc and Chesterton, because of their Francophilia and their Prussophobia, I think were very two-dimensional in their attitude to the war. And they both paid a high price for the war, of course. Belloc lost his wife, nothing to do with the war, but he lost his wife in 1914, and was distraught by that. I think, because he traveled a lot, I think he had a bit of a guilt conscience. He wasn't around enough. So she dies, leaving 5 children, 3 boys, 2 girls. And Belloc wore black broadcloth, a bit like Queen Victoria, wore black for the rest of his life. And Elodie's room in their home in Gracelane, he never touched, left it as it was. And every night on his way to bed would pause outside her room and say a prayer. So he carried that with him, and then at the end of World War I, he lost his eldest son, Louis. And in the Second World War, he lost his youngest son, Peter, and that precipitated the stroke, which basically put an end. Belloc would live till 1953, but after 1941, he writes nothing. So both world wars came at a heavy cost to Belloc. And of course, G.K. Chesterton lost his beloved brother Cecil in the final days of World War I also. And they both lost friends. So the war came at a great cost. And I think you see a change in both of them. The rambunctiousness, the robustiousness, the joie de vivre is always there on a deeper level because of their Catholicism, the faith. But they're not this, let's just have a great bacon and beer, right? The bacon and beer was softened a bit, the spirit of the flying in. You can't really imagine Chesterton writing a novel like The Flying In after World War I. In fact, he doesn't write novels like that after World War I. But it doesn't mean that they're finished. On the contrary, what we have is less levitas, but we have more gravitas. And some of the most important things are written afterwards. So they both become great apologists for the Catholic faith. We think, obviously, of Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy, which was written earlier in 1908, but The Everlasting Man, his book on Thomas Aquinas, his book on St. Francis of Assisi, the first book of his I read, The Well and the Shallows. The title of that book, The Well, is the Catholic Church. It has depth, profundity, life-giving water, the quick freshes, as Shakespeare would say, living, fresh water. And then everything else is the shallows, the well and the shallows. So Chesterton is a great apologist, and Belloc, survivals and new arrivals, the great heresies. And I sometimes talk about their different approaches to apologetics. Is that Chesterton's, his wordplay is like sword play, right? He's used to paradox, alliteration, all these literary tropes, and he's using a swordsman to disarm his enemies with the wit and quickness of his writing. Belloc, on the other hand, when you read something like Survivals and New Arrivals, he just trundles over the horizon in a tank. And just systematically crushes everything in his way. But 2 great apologists for the Catholic faith, for which we should be grateful. And historians, note at all that Belloc is the more important historian. He took the great pioneering work by Father Lingard, his History of England, from the early 19th century, which is popularized by William Cobbett, and put his own 4-volume History of England. And the purpose of that, as he said, was to undo that arrogant nonsense, that tomfool Protestant history. Because, of course, the history is written by the victors, So what had happened is 150 years of Catholics being executed in England, followed by another 150 years of them being persecuted in England, is airbrushed out of English history, right? The Catholic Church was an imposition upon the English people, which is an absolute diabolical lie. The English were one of the most Catholic nations in Christendom. There's no appetite for Protestantism. The church was ripped away from the English people by Henry VIII, and it took 150 years of executions, followed by another 150 years of persecutions to rip England away from the faith, because the English resolutely try to hold on to it. So Belloc tells that story, which is a story that has to be told, needed to be told, and thanks be to God for him for that. One thing that sort of distinguishes the two, of course, is what sometimes I call Chestertonian charity versus Bellocian bellicosity. So, for instance, Chesterton wrote a book on George Bernard Shaw, where he basically attacks Shaw's position and perspective from page 1, but he does it with such charity and such dignity that Shaw and Chesterton remain friends, which also, by the way, says a great deal for George Bernard Shaw, right? That he can also, in return, show charity even when, if you like, he turns the other cheek, right? Chesterton slaps him on the cheek. Rather than hit him back, he turns the other cheek. So that says a great deal for Bernard Shaw, but it says a great deal for Chesterton. But the best thing is what I call the War of the Wells, as in H.G. Wells. And the different responses to Belloc and Chesterton to this provocation. So H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Outline of Sanity. Sorry, not The Outline of Sanity. Chesterton wrote a book called The Outline of Sanity. H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Outline of History. And it's basically the history of the world from our prehistoric ancestors to the modern world, the modern times. But it was from a perspective of chronological snobbery, to use a phrase that C.S. Lewis would adopt, and of what you call progressivism. The whole of humanity is on a progressive march and ascent towards a golden age in the future, where we will be liberated from superstition and religion and will be delivered from evil by the power of science. So this is the animating principle of it. So it's a best-selling novel. That was also a Freudian slip, but it is a sort of novel. It's a best-selling book. I mean, a young Jewish girl in New York reads it when she's about 13 years old and becomes an atheist upon reading it. I'm sure around the world there are many others. That young Jewish girl's name was Joy Davidman. If you don't know who she is, she would later become Mrs. C.S. Lewis. But she becomes an atheist after reading that book. I'm going to circle back on that story in a moment. So Belloc responds to H.G. Wells's Outline of History with a book called A Companion to Mr. Wells's Outline of History, in which he demolishes, one after the other, all of H.G. Wells's sort of arguments. H.G. Wells is not amused. And he writes a book, Mr. Belloc Objects, to which Belloc wrote a book, Mr. Belloc Still Objects. So these two go back and forth over the true understanding of history, and Belloc become more and more bellicose. H.G. Wells become more and more bellicose, and the two men become enemies, and they won't talk to each other. There's actually some people saw them in the same club in London. They publicly snubbed each other, refused to speak to each other. Bellocian bellicosity. G.K. Chesterton wrote The Everlasting Man as his own companion to Mr. Wells's Outline of History. But he begins it by praising H.G. Wells for his diligence and hard work and labour in writing that book. Not ironically, not satirically, but honestly. He concludes by mentioning H.G. Wells. Other than that, he doesn't mention H.G. Wells at all, but what he does do is to give a Christian outline of history, the everlasting man. And when C.S. Lewis first read Chesterton's book, he said, he was an atheist at the time, he said, I first saw the Christian outline of history laid out before me in a way that made sense. And this was a major milestone upon Lewis's progress towards conversion, which would finally be accomplished after a long night talk with Tolkien in 1931. But that's another discussion. So Lewis becomes a Christian, with Chesterton's The Everlasting Man being a significant part of that journey. And of course, he then starts writing Christian apologetics himself, Mere Christianity, etc. And this Jewish girl, who's now a Jewish communist, atheist in New York, starts reading C.S. Lewis. And eventually, because of reading C.S. Lewis, she becomes a Christian. And then she corresponds with C.S. Lewis. They become friends. And eventually, Joy Davidman becomes Mrs. C.S. Lewis. So in some sense, you see the power. Someone said to me when I was researching my book, Literary Converts, that what was happening in the literary revival in the early 20th century was a network of minds and a network of grace. That what people are doing, saying, writing, impacting lots of other people in ways that we don't know. This is an example. Chesterton never knew that his writing of The Everlasting Man was a significant contributor to C.S. Lewis's conversion, nor that that would lead to someone who'd lost their faith because of reading H.G. Wells's book coming back to the faith. This is the power of evangelizing literally on a one-to-one basis, just touching people. Okay, Bellocian Bellocosity at its best. And the thing is with Belloc, if you don't have a sense of humor, you don't understand what he's doing. Because this poem, another favorite of mine, it's not a great work of charity. But it is a great work of humor. I wonder if I can find my glasses, otherwise I'll squint. Here we are. You may know it, but it's very apropos our topic of the dynamic duo. This is Belloc defending Chesterton with his famous poem, Lines to a Don. I can't believe there's another poem in the English language that has more insults in it, directed at one person, than this one. Lines to a Dawn by Hilaire Belloc. Remote and ineffectual dawn that dared attack my Chesterton. With what poor weapon half impelled, unlearnt, unsteady, hardly held, unworthy for a tilt with men, your quavering and corroded pen. Dawn poor at bed and worse at table, dawn pinched, dawn starved, dawn miserable. Dawn stuttering, dawn with roving eyes, dawn nervous, dawn of cruditize. Dawn clerical, dawn ordinary, dawn self-absorbed and solitary. Dawn here and there, dawn epileptic, dawn puffed and empty, dawn dyspeptic. Dawn middle class, dawn sycophantic, dawn dull, dawn brutish, dawn pedantic. Dawn hypocritical, dawn bad. Dawn furtive, dawn 3/4 mad. Dawn, since a man must make an end, dawn that shall never be my friend. Dawn different from these regal dons, with hearts of gold and lungs of bronze, who shout and bang and roar and bawl the absolute across the hall, or sail in ampling, billowing gown, enormous through the sacred town, bearing from college to their homes deep cargoes of gigantic tomes. Dons admirable, dons of might, uprising on my inward sight, compact of ancient tales and port and sleep and learning of a sort. Dons English, worthy of the land. Dons rooted, dons that understand. Good dons, perpetual, that remain a landmark walling in the plain, the horizon of my memories like large and comfortable trees. Dawn very much apart from these. thou scapegoat Don, thou Don devoted, Don to shine to thine own damnation quoted, perplexed to find thy trivial name, reared in my verse to lasting shame. Don dreadful, rasping Don unwearing, repulsive Don, Don past all bearing. Don of the cold and doubtful breath, Don despicable, Don of death. Don nasty, skimpy, silent level, Don evil, Don that serves the devil. Don ugly. That makes 50 lines. There is a canon which confines a rhymed octosyllabic curse, if written in iambic verse, to 50 lines. I never cut. I far prefer to end it, but believe me, I shall soon return. My fires are banked, but still they burn, to write some more about the Don that dared attack my Chesterton. You've just got to love that. That's great. So obviously Belloc's love for Chesterton's clear in that poem. Only Belloc can show love for someone so bellicosely. Chesterton, his part, of course, if you read his autobiography, is a whole chapter entitled Portrait of a Friend, dedicated to Hilaire Belloc. And most of the accounts of Chesterton's funeral in 1936 talk about the joy that people felt having known the man and the man's legacy and the great gift that Chesterton was. But Belloc was found sitting on the steps outside the railway tavern, just a stone's throw from the church in which Chesterton had been received, crying inconsolably, weeping inconsolably for the loss of his friend. And Belloc wrote a book called On the Place of Gilbert Keith Chesterton in English Letters, following Chesterton's death. And he referred to this difference between them, between Chestertonian charity on the one hand and Bellocian bellicosity on the other. And he said that this approach by Chesterton sometimes meant he pulled his punches. He didn't go for the kill when he's in discussion for somebody. And he says, but that's really of no matter because he's in heaven. Which is really what Belloc's saying, is that, you know, it's much more important to retain charity even if you lose the argument. And the Chesterton understood that, and Belloc often didn't. Both men were homo viator. Examples of homo viator: man on a journey, man on a pilgrimage, man on a quest for heaven. And on this, the birthday of both men, I think we should celebrate both of their lives. And I think we should, the prayer we might want to address to them is the prayer that Horatio addresses to Hamlet at the climax of that play. May flights of angels sing them to their rest. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, time again for a couple of questions, if you'll take them, Joseph.
Sure.
Somebody else.
One over there.
A quick one, maybe you said it and I missed it. Who was the unfortunate Don that attacked Chesterton?
Yeah, I know I did know at one time, but I can't remember, and I think that's probably the way it should be. I mean, Belloc makes a point of not naming him, and there's probably a reason for that. But Arnold Lunn, another convert, tells him his autobiography about how he and a couple of his friends drunkenly recited Belloc's poem To a Don at Cambridge. I can't remember if that was the Don or just a Don they didn't like, but there's a story about that as well.
So, thank you so much for your talk. It was super fun. At the beginning, you talked about Belloc slightly deforming Chesterton with his francophilia, his manic francophilia. So could you give us, and I love this idea of Belloc as a Francophile, and then of course Chesterton has given us such a wonderful appreciation of Englishness. Can you give us 1, 2, or maybe 3 reasons why Americans should be more Anglophiles than Francophiles?
Well, the first one is, thank you for that question, as provocative as it is. Well, the first answer, you want 3. First reason that Americans should be more Anglophile than Francophile is G.K. Chesterton. Point number 1. I'm just gonna say, I mean, give me a Frenchman that can equal William Shakespeare. I'm taking the bait. Have you noticed this? Victor Hugo, on the same level as. Clearly, the man must be an Australian or something. All right, third one. Clearly, if you want to go back to the roots of the United States, you're talking about both England and Spain. The French were somewhere down there in Louisiana at some point, weren't they? And that will do. I think that's the best I can do.
Okay, one more question over here.
I had a very superficial education, but it was all in Catholic schools, from grade school, high school, university, and I had heard of Yeats and I had heard of H.G. Wells through that, but it was not until 10 or 15 years after all of that schooling that I heard of Chesterton and later Belloc, and they'd also, the first book I read in college was C.S. Lewis' Abolition of Man, so that was acceptable apparently. But you've, I'm sure, thought about this because of all your work, and thank you for bringing all this to our attention. Why was that not part of our attention in the time period I'm talking about, 70s, 80s?
Yeah, well, I also was at high school in the 70s, obviously the other side of the pond, but the same thing. By that stage, what we would now call radical relativism, secular fundamentalism was in the ascendant, and Christianity was given in England lip service because it was part. So I think I remember once a semester, the whole school would go to a religious service, and I just remember the teachers treating the whole thing with the barely concealed contempt, and all the rest of us wondering, what's all this about? So I think there was an effort to banish God and vanquish God from people's minds, right? And of course you begin with the minds of children during education. And it hasn't worked because, as Chesterton says, that the Catholic Church has been killed many times, has died many times, but it's always risen from the dead because it worships a God that knows the way out of the grave. And I don't know if an H.G. Wells Society exists, but I bet it does not have a conference anywhere near as lively as this one. I think it speaks for itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Okay, we will have a quick break, but while I have everyone's attention, for the breakout sessions after lunch this afternoon, if you look in your program book, during each of the 2 periods, there is breakout session 1, 2, and 3, and correspondingly on the map, you'll find the breakout rooms labeled 1, 2, 3. This will be room number 1. Number 2 is downstairs next to the meal hall, and room number 3 is on the way to the outside afterglow space. It's around the corner there, but staff will be in place to help direct you, but just that's what those numbers correspond to, 1, 2, and 3. So 1 in here, 2 downstairs, and 3 around the corner. And we will be back here again in 5 minutes' time. So take a quick break and join us for Fabiola Garza. Thank you.